Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome to CSIS and this virtual event on explaining the drop in global foreign direct investment. I'm Matthew Goodman. I'm Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS and delighted to be here with you and with my colleagues from the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics, one of whom, the leader of which I'm going to introduce in a second. But we're delighted to have you with us for this webinar. Today, we're going to focus on a great new report, the latest and I think 27th report of the Global Trade Alert, which is the leading hub for data and analysis on commercial policies worldwide. It's a resource that we all really rely on here in Washington. And we're delighted to have the founder of that Global Trade Alert and the author of this report, who I'll introduce in a second. But first, let me just say the report is entitled Advancing Sustainable Development with Foreign Direct Investment, Why Policy Must Be Reset. You can find it, I hope, on the site, the page that you entered from. So I commend it to you. It looks a little intimidating because it's 125 plus pages, but it's actually quite nicely laid out, quite accessible. With a lot of charts and things that are easy to grasp. So I really commend it to you. It's a terrific report. And it really talks about why FDI is so important to the global economy and global development. It talks about how FDI has been on a declining trend even before COVID and why that is. And it talks about how government policy has contributed to that, and how government policy, it recommends how government policy might be improved to try to reverse those trends. By the way, this is not my show, and I want to leave it to the author and the discussants. But just to say, I'm particularly interested in the recommendations about foreign direct investment regulation and screening. This is a topic that we've been looking at closely in the economics program. With the enhanced investment screening laws and regulations across much of the certainly advanced world, including the United States, and the implications of that for FDI. As a former Treasury guy, I always start with the perspective that FDI should be open and we should welcome it. It's good for us. But there are exceptions for national security when we have to screen. And I think it is very important, and this report, I think, echoes the point that we need to be sure that we're really using these tools for the right purposes and they don't have unintended consequences. So that's one aspect that I was particularly interested in. But let me, as I say, leave it to the author and the discussants. The run of show is going to be, I'm going to introduce the author now. He's going to present some slides and a summary of the report. And then I'm going to hand to my colleague, Scott Kennedy, who holds the trustee chair in Chinese Business and Economics. He's going to then become the moderator of the discussion and introduce our discussant, and then offer his own thoughts about the report and questions. You are then welcome to submit questions. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to submit your questions starting now, but certainly as the presentation is made, you're welcome. And then we will try to take as many of those questions as we can during the discussion period. We have 1 hour, or now less than 1 hour. So let me stop talking and introduce our speaker guest, Simon Evenett, who, although he lives in a sort of monastery town in the remote part of Switzerland near a lake, is very well known here in Washington. He's a familiar figure on the trade policy scene. A real wonk in the best sense of the word. We all rely a lot on his work. He is formerly the professor of international trade and economic development at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, and the founder, as I mentioned, of the Global Trade Alert and the author of this report. So with no further ado, let me hand it over to Simon.
Okay, so Matt, thank you very much for for introducing me there. Let me try and pull up the right screen. Let's do that. And it's a great pleasure to be able to give this presentation. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank your CSIS team who've done a great job putting this on. This 27th report of the Global Trade Alert was co-authored with Johannes Fritz and addresses the parlous state of foreign direct investment. Let me start by explaining what is at stake here, especially as it relates to emerging markets and developing countries. According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the latest estimates we have is that $11 trillion has been invested in emerging markets in foreign direct investment. That's a very serious global footprint, and it reflects the fact that for many years, FDI was seen as a hallmark of globalization. That $11 trillion has, of course, translated into employment opportunities for firms to upgrade, to tie into global value chains and the like, and it has also helped integrate these emerging markets into the world economy, which on the whole we tended to think is a very good thing. Now, the reason that I have some concern here is that I'm going to show you some FDI dynamics which suggest that either FDI is losing momentum or it's not delivering as much as it could do. Before I get into this, to the actual findings of the report, just please remember the following contextual point. If there's about $11 trillion invested in emerging markets, given what we know about depreciation rates for capital in emerging markets, that means around $450 billion of that capital is going to depreciate every year. So in order to maintain the current stock of FDI in emerging markets, we need companies to be willing to invest $450 billion minimum. And so this point, I think, highlights the fundamental question we ask in the report: what is happening to the commercial viability of FDI? Because if the returns on FDI are not sufficiently high, then we will begin to see companies be reluctant to make sizable investments of the nature that I've just described. And so we would then see FDI diminishing in its impact around the world economy, and that would be a step backwards. So let me explain what the findings are that we've put together here. So when you turn to the inflows of FDI, you can see a very disturbing trend, and that is that even before the pandemic, the FDI inflows into around the world, I should say, not just into emerging markets, have fallen. There was, of course, a significant fall last year, and indeed, greenfield projects in emerging markets were down 57% last year. And across the globe, FDI was down. But it would be wrong to think that this is just a pandemic phenomenon. If you take the inflows of FDI and you sensibly benchmark it against either world GDP, world levels of investment, or world trade, bearing in mind that trade and investment are sometimes substitutes, you can see that since essentially the onset of the global financial crisis, the trend has been for FDI inflows not to keep up with the other big aggregates of the world economy. So it's not like FDI has gone into reverse. It's just that the inflows of FDI have not grown as quickly as other key benchmarks in the world economy, which suggests that its importance, at least as a new source of capital and the like, is diminishing. So this is, I think, a warning sign to us that once reliable source of globalization, or feature of globalization, is in trouble. And we can see here, and by the way, if one digs a little deeper into the nominal numbers, for literally the past decade, FDI into developing countries has ranged between $500 to $600 billion per year. And it has not broken out of that range, despite the fact that many developing countries and emerging markets are growing very fast. So you get a sense of the relative importance of FDI is in decline. So this is a first concern. Now, of course, we want to understand why is FDI into emerging markets and elsewhere falling. And perhaps one of the most interesting findings in the report is that certainly since 2015, we have evidence from US multinationals, US multinational enterprises, which points to the FDI returns in many emerging market regions not exceeding that of the FDI in the European Union. So let me put that in a little bit of context. It's often argued that investing in emerging markets is more risky than investing in more mature markets, industrialized economies. So we would need to see a slightly higher rate of return in emerging markets in order to compensate for that higher risk. What we have in fact seen when we calculate the average rates of return on investments into different emerging market regions is that for the Asia Pacific region, excluding Japan, Southern and Central America, that region, and also now Africa, since 2015, these regions are not delivering returns to US multinationals, which are much in excess of what US multinationals can receive if they invest in the European Union. So this must raise concerns about what is the commercial viability, what is the risk-adjusted rate of return for new FDI into emerging markets. Now, as we know as economists, the track record of previous FDI may not tell you, may not necessarily correspond to what the FDI on a new project in the future is. But with a track record of such low returns, it must be harder in corporate boardrooms to justify allocating more FDI to emerging markets when you can obtain the same levels of return by investing in the European Union. The only standout region, as you can see, is the Middle East, where, of course, returns on FDI are very strongly linked to the oil price and alike, and even there, the returns have been declining as well. So for us, this was the canary in the coal mine. This is the thing which made us sit up and listen and wonder whether or not there is something going wrong in the FDI dynamics, and whether or not actually the outcomes here are beginning to become a source of concern. Now, as you noted, Matt, when you introduced this, the title of the report links FDI to sustainable development. And so one of the things we did was also to look at what are the rates of return that US multinationals are earning in different sectors around the world, and particularly in emerging markets. And what we found is that if we estimate for the years 2015 to 18, which is the last years we have data available from the Department of Commerce, we can estimate the average return on assets invested across a range of industries, from manufacturing to wholesale trade, retail trade, and then into some sectors which we typically associate with sustainable development. And the results really surprised us, which is that we still see quite healthy returns for investing in manufacturing. And that's so important because it's often a big driver of employment in emerging markets. We also see quite healthy returns in wholesale trade and retail trade, which are big employers too. But let's not forget that since 2015, governments have tried to encourage firms to invest in sectors which are associated with sustainable development. And here the returns are much, much more meager. So if you take the case of educational services, US multinationals have earned on average 2.5% on returns in this sector. And if you take the case of healthcare, they're earning 1% a year. So the payback period for an investment in healthcare at the moment is roughly 90 years, which is exceptionally high. In terms of exceptionally long, I should say, for a payback period. And so what this strongly suggests is that maybe the commercial attractions of investing in sectors which are important for sustainable development might not be as high as the advocates of sustainable development would like it to be. And it does beg the question, what's the commercial viability of investing in these sectors where sustainable development is key, and whether or not enough is being done, or whether or not policy needs to be rejigged to take account of this. Well, talking of policy, another important finding in the report is that when you look at policies which are conducive to FDI, we see that the share of new policy interventions conducive to FDI around the world is moving in the wrong direction. And that's true for all nations, whether you break out the G20 countries from the non-G20 countries, and whether you even consider the least developed countries on their own. We see a falling share in the number of policies which are conducive to FDI. And what's behind this are greater localization requirements imposed on foreign direct investors. We see reductions in tariffs, which on the face of it are a very good thing for the trading system. But for firms which are looking for tariff jumping FDI, of course, this is a step in the wrong direction. We also see a larger number of countries adopting FDI screening mechanisms, which is what you mentioned, Matt. These have mushroomed in the last 5 years and is a real source of concern for foreign direct investment. Maybe in the Q&A, we can come back to what we're learning about the effects of these FDI screening mechanisms, which ostensibly were often put together to target certain emerging markets, but in fact are actually having a broader reach. So what we're seeing over time is that policy is turning against FDI. We also show in the report that policy is much more restrictive in the service sectors than in manufacturing. So as economies become more service sector dominated, more and more economic activity is being covered by a more restrictive FDI regime. And so all of this, I think, is pushing policy in the wrong direction. So if we put the story together, what have we seen? We have policy moving in the wrong direction. We have returns on FDI falling, and perhaps in the light of that, we should not be surprised that FDI inflows are diminishing relative to other key global metrics. And that's the story that we try and tell in the report. Now, of course, that's a bad news story. What can we do about it? We have essentially 4 points to make here, 3 do's and 1 don't. The first do is we have to focus, we need to encourage governments, the international organizations, the development organizations, to focus on the right KPIs. And one of the important KPIs is surely the commercial returns on FDI. Companies are not charities. They will not engage in FDI unless they see it as commercially viable. And the evidence that we've shown here is that the commercial viability of FDI is being questioned. And so when governments do audits, international organizations do audits on their FDI policy, it's not enough to highlight that policy has moved in a liberalizing direction. Is that translating into higher FDI returns? So now, if you want to have an analogy here, when we talk about poverty alleviation, we track the number of people in poverty. We care about the end result. When we look at FDI policy, instead, governments track the number of liberalizing measures. They don't ask, does it translate into a better ultimate outcome, which in this case is higher levels of higher commercial viability for this important tool of development. The second is, if we are interested in advancing sustainable development through FDI, then it would be better to target a lot of the financial support to the very sectors that host countries think are conducive to their sustainable development. And it would be also better to align the outward FDI support that many countries give with those development priorities. So there's a clear set of implications for where countries should offer financial support for FDI. Now, there is something of an arms race going on in terms of FDI incentives around the world, both in terms of inward and outward FDI. So there's, on net, probably a good reason for trying to scale back some of these incentives, and nothing I want to say here detracts from that. But if you are going to target, if we are going to do anything, we could at least try and target the FDI incentives to the sectors which countries think are central to their sustainable development. I think the third recommendation is, and we see this with investment screening, with indicators of economic policy uncertainty rising, is that foreign direct investment needs to be de-risked. And I think the cumulative effect of lots of regulatory interventions, many of which were not coordinated across different arms of government, are probably adding to the riskiness of FDI, and governments should step back and do an inventory of all of these developments and ask whether or not they have inadvertently made the risk-adjusted returns lower than they need to be. So that's an area, and again, I think this has direct implications for the implementation of those investment screening mechanisms that we were talking about earlier. There's one clear don't here, which is that one can artificially boost the returns to FDI by raising trade barriers. And this is clearly the wrong thing to do. We would not recommend this. There are other much more private sector friendly ways of enhancing the commercial viability of FDI rather than essentially throwing sand into the international trading system. So that's clearly something I would not recommend, and we do not recommend in the report. So perhaps I can draw this to a close and say, I hope that this overview gives you a sense about the arguments that we've developed and the recommendations that we've developed in the report. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion from Mary and from colleagues and the questions. Thank you very much.
Well, terrific. Simon, thanks so much for introducing your report. This is Scott Kennedy, and want to thank my colleague in crime, Matt Goodman, for getting the show rolling. And it's been excellent to partner with the economics program on this event, on other projects. I want to turn things over to our discussant in just a second, but just to say, for folks who aren't familiar with the Global Trade Monitor, which has its origins in the global financial crisis from 2008 and 9. Simon and his team have done an amazing job over the last 12 to 13 years to document the rise of protectionism around the world. And I could tell you, for someone that tries to pay attention to this, how difficult this is as just an empirical research issue. I think there's only two other things which are probably as equally or harder to study, and that is elite Chinese politics and corruption. It's very difficult to get data on either of those two things, and I think trade protectionism and FDI rank there. So Simon, kudos to you and your team for sticking with it and figuring out how to follow this for so long and being so helpful to the rest of us. I'm going to turn things over to our discussant now, who's going to offer her feedback on the report and the topic in general, and then we're going to introduce everyone to join in the conversation. I'm really delighted that we have with us today Mary Lovely from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. She is also a professor of economics and the Melvin A. Eggers Faculty Scholar at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Try saying that 3 times fast. Her academic work focuses on the effects of China's reform and opening on its firms and workers and on the global economy. So she does the day-to-day nitty-gritty work of looking at foreign investment in China and elsewhere, and is really well placed to comment on this report. And China figures in this report in many different places, but I know her comments are going to go beyond China. You can find her work in many venues in academia, as well as on NPR, Wall Street Journal, Marketplace, Bloomberg, Politico, Axios. She is central to the conversation here in Washington and around the world about China and today's topic. So Mary, it's great to have you here. I should also mention that we are fellow China travelers, although for the moment we have not been able to pack our suitcases. Although I just looked, and I'm curious if Mary has too. I looked in my closet, my suitcase is there. I dusted it off. I am getting ready for one day being able to get on the road again and enjoy jet lag. So Mary, thanks for being with us and look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's always a pleasure to be with the folks at CSIS, and thanks again to the production team for making this so easy to participate in this event. First, I'd like to thank Simon and Johannes Fritz for this interesting and provocative report. I use the word provocative deliberately. The report should provoke us to take note of how changing policies toward FDI are affecting the ability of poorer countries to meet sustainable development goals, which supposedly we all share. I say supposedly because I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about the Western attitude toward outward FDI. The Global Trade Alert has become an important resource, as Scott mentioned, for all of us who are concerned about the direction and impact of national policies that affect global trade and investment flows. And Simon and his team do the hard work so that we don't have to. So thank you, Simon. It's a great resource, and I hope people who haven't looked it up will take advantage of that soon. This morning, Simon in his presentation got right to the heart of it. FDI flows seem to be declining. Returns on FDI between sort of now I would say risk-free, but lower risk venues like the EU and foreign projects are converging. And there's fewer policy interventions that help to generate needed cross-border investment flows. I'd like to kick off our discussion, and I know we have many people in the audience who have quite a bit of experience. I'd like to kick off the discussion by asking just 3 questions Are we sure that the trends that Simon is documenting are happening? Does it matter if they're happening, and are governments to blame? So first, I think we see that there has been a drop in FDI, but there's also been several shocks that complicate our reading of the record. So is this a temporary happening, or is it permanent? There's enormous year-to-year variation in global FDI flows. Certainly flows have fallen back from their pre-global financial crisis heights before 2008. But it's not clear to me that FDI as a share of world investment won't return back to its post-2010 levels of about 10%. Shocks such as China's stock market crisis in 2017 and of course COVID-19 in 2020 may lead us to interpret the trends more pessimistically than perhaps we should. And how FDI changed in 2020 is instructive. According to Nicholas Lardy and Tianli Huang, who are my colleagues at the Peterson Institute, global FDI flows in the first half of 2020 declined by the largest amount on record, so it was a huge shock. Inflows into the United States, usually the largest recipient of FDI, were down 61%. Inflows into the European Union were off 29%. In contrast, cumulative FDI inflows to China through the third quarter of 2020 were up about 2%, putting China on track to set an annual record inflow of more than 140 billion. So we have a few behemoths here who really dominate these trends, and we need to try to pick through this noise. So I would argue that the aggregate trends are often dominated by a few major recipients, particularly the US and China, and that for the developing world, the jury is still out. We need to watch these FDI trends carefully and be inspired by Simon and Johannes's work, and see if these flows recover as economies and people recover from the pandemic. Secondly, I'd like to ask, does it matter if FDI flows are declining? And here Simon and Johannes's report rightly note that developing countries need the, quote, right kind of FDI, which they link specifically to investment in sectors related to the SDG, such as utilities and healthcare. This kind of FDI feels right. You can do good and earn well in sort of a double bonus. But I would argue that developing countries still very much need FDI that lets them exploit their comparative advantage in a way that raises productivity and wages. That is, they need FDI in manufacturing and in other sectors. As countries get richer, social development indicators generally rise apace. Generally, or mainly, the point of FDI is to create wealth for the host country and for the investor. And this wealth creation can be a force for good. Especially if it leads to inclusive growth, something that I think the world has largely lost faith in, but nevertheless, which has been an enormous engine for good in the past. So unfortunately, as I'll talk a little bit more later, this view of FDI is out of favor, but I'm sure that developing countries still very much need this type of inflow. India is a good example here. Thirdly, I want to raise the question of whether rates of return are really falling for foreign investors. Simon and Johannes have dug into the US data on outward foreign investment, and I want to point out that this is no mean feat. The Bureau of Economic Analysis data is not user-friendly, despite the many efforts of the fine people who work there to try to make it so. So sometimes I say, fools go where angels fear to tread, because I have also looked at these data very recently. But there's some reason to be extremely careful in drawing too strong a conclusion from the data that Simon presents. First, as he notes, this is just an average, not a marginal rate of return, so we don't know how much this decline is driving investment flows, even if it's happening. Secondly, the analysis is complicated by changes in investment mix. Some activities are riskier, more capital intensive, and clearly more profitable than others. And lastly, they're affected by profit shifting behavior by multinational firms, all of which require us to be humble in our what we can say conclusively about the trends that we see. Clearly, I think we need to see how investors, quote unquote, vote with their feet over the next few years. That is, we really need to see if trends are pointing toward lower flows into developing countries, which would clearly be of concern. Whatever the difficulties in analyzing specific data sources on rates of return, Simon and Johanna's analysis does raise concern that rates of return are equalizing across locations prematurely. That is, rates are equalizing at a time when it is still widely believed that the value of the marginal product of capital remains higher in developing countries than in developed countries. Flows of capital from richer to poorer countries are still very much needed, and we need the price mechanism to keep private investment flows going in the right direction. So this is a major concern. And while I have some doubts about this data source, I think that this is right on the money in terms of what we need to be watching. Simon and Johannes rightly ask whether there's evidence that government policy is partly to blame for falling returns. They find some signs that it is. Governments have done less to pull policy levers that favor foreign investment and more to reduce tariff walls that might force it. Governments have also grown keen on investment screening. Measures against service FDI in particular, which Simon noted, are very worrying given the need for a local presence for trade in many services and the hope that many of us have that liberalization in services can renew the Western favor toward freer trade and investment with developing countries. I would ask, though, whether it's bad that countries have implemented fewer policy interventions conducive to FDI. I would argue that here really we need to see the devil in the details. Shouldn't we be seeking a level playing field for domestic and foreign investors? China, for example, took years to provide the same opportunities for domestic private firms that it offered to foreign investors in some sector. It's not clear to me that all, positive interventions are created equal. When they offset market failures, they can be very beneficial to the host country. In other cases, preferences for foreign investors can retard domestic private sector growth. And when they move jobs away from one country to another, such as when FDI subsidies lure forms away from higher wage countries, I think we see the backlash that results from that, as these policies are widely viewed as unfair. In closing, I would like to return to my concern about how we in the rich West, and I include part of the East here, I guess, view FDI into developing countries. I am afraid that there's a growing tendency to see it in an entirely negative light. FDI may be seen as a hallmark of globalization, as Simon said, but unfortunately, that is increasingly viewed as a threat. We no longer speak about the pro-development effects of technology transfer. In fact, reading the WTO pages on the Doha round is a bit like a trip down memory lane when the West had the confidence to view technology transfer as something positive and technology and information as something they were willing to share. Our fear of China, the developing country that has received the most FDI ever, has perhaps clouded our view of FDI in general, and perhaps the West's role in development more generally. Now, we want to bring supply chains home, as we noticed this week with a 250-page supply chain report coming from the Biden administration. We want to bring supply chains home. We want to make sure that technology doesn't pass outside our borders. We shouldn't be too comfortable, I think, hiding behind investment into SDGs. I think the world still needs income generation in poor countries, and that means investment in things that will force adjustment in the rest of the world. And we have to think about how we can do that in a way that is politically palatable and, in fact, wealth enhancing for most people. How might these anti-FDI policies matter in the long run for the global organization of production? After reading Simon's report, I feel that they will matter. I'm just pretty confident that they're not going to matter in the way governments intend. Perhaps we can talk about that during the discussion. So in closing, thanks to Simon for his fine presentation, and to him and to Johannes Fritz for this thought-provoking and highly readable, I might add, report. I look forward to discussion to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That was really terrific. I really appreciate those remarks, which covered a lot of ground. And I have some questions I wanted to ask too, and the audience is starting to fill up the Q&A box as well. But I want to just pause here because you made some really, really good points, just to give Simon a chance to have an initial reaction to some of the things that you said, which we all need to think about. So Simon, why don't I turn the floor over to you to give you a chance to have an initial brief reaction to some of the things, the points that Mary made, if you would.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll just focus on a couple, and I think that the highest profile points. I'm absolutely with Mary in terms of the shifting view that some people have about FDI into developing countries becoming a bad thing. I think this is this is not a very convincing reading of the evidence, and I think it's an unhealthy step. I would also add, almost paradoxically, that some of the people who are more critical about what FDI does in developing countries are also pushing international business to do more with respect to their FDI. So there seems to be a very strange policy dynamic going on, which I think we need to talk through. And I think on reflection, I think we need to engage much more with the sustainable development folks to actually talk through how we understand FDI and how they understand FDI. So I think that would be one observation. The second observation, I hope that Mary's right that FDI revives in the years ahead, especially after the pandemic exits. But I'm worried that a legacy of low returns is actually going to make it hard in corporate boardrooms to make the case for FDI in the future. It's true that, and she's quite right, FDI decisions should be forward-looking. You should take account of the project that's in front of you. But just about every boardroom always has a few contrarians, and they will point to the track record in the past. And it must be that the track record in the past for a number of projects isn't particularly good. I don't particularly buy the argument that these returns have been diminished by profit shifting. I know the profits can be shifted, but it's not clear to me how that would necessarily affect profits in emerging markets more than that in the industrialized countries. I'm not suggesting that Mary made that argument, but I think the findings that returns are diminishing, it's a bit hard to pin on profit shifting unless you've got some story as to why profit shifting has become more aggressive in recent years and with respect to emerging market FDI compared to European Union FDI. So I think I'm a little less sanguine than Mary is. I hope she's right and I'm wrong, but I think the prospects for FDI are a bit more clouded than maybe Mary does. Thank you.
Sure, Simon, thank you. Let me add to the conversation now just a couple points, and then we'll get your feedback there, and we'll go to the audience. So I think it deserves foot stomping, the broader point that you make in the report and that Mary does as well about the rethinking around globalization. For many years, the basic metric of what businesses should do were built around the idea of openness, efficiency, comparative advantage, and how you could move and produce things at the most affordable price, and et cetera, and profitably, just in time, right? Of course, we've seen now where the language of the day is around really two ideas. One is supply chain resilience, right? We need to make sure that we can have access to the different components and all parts, from inputs to manufacturers, goods, because there could be a whole bunch of reasons that we might lose. It might be the pandemic, it might be climate change, it may be geostrategic challenges, and therefore we need to build in resilience. The second is national security, that foreign investors are bringing with them dangers, stealing your IP, weakening your national defenses, et cetera, and therefore you need to be hyper vigilant about this. And so it seems what you document is that we have swung heavily in this pendulum And I'm wondering, is it, we're probably not going to have that pendulum swing all the way back, but is there a middle ground someplace where we can figure out how to have both the benefits of openness and efficiency and some supply chain resilience and a reasonable concerns about national security? Because I just don't see us overcoming those concerns about supply chains and national security in a short amount of time. But maybe we could smartly figure out a way to achieve that balance. And so I'm curious, and today and for the next few days, a lot of the world's leaders will be meeting in Cornwall to discuss this very topic. Supply chains is central to their conversation, and we could give them some advice. Not only should they read your report, but just in case these global leaders won't read every page, what could we tell them about the findings from your report of how to achieve the balance there? Second, question is just about the data, and I think Mary's probably in a better position to ask questions about the origins of the data, different types of data. I'm not going to do that, but I am curious, if we poke below the surface of the aggregate levels, what are some of the variations we see in trends? Two kinds that I'm wondering about. Washington's had this big conversation about decoupling, and so they talk about sort of a bifurcated world, right? Are we seeing bifurcation? If you can measure sort of origin and destination, does it look like the world in terms of foreign direct investment is starting to segregate either in two parts or regions or something like that? So what's the geographic transformation in FDI that you're seeing in addition to the decline? The second is in terms of sectors. Are we seeing a bigger decline in high tech, where there's been so much national security concern lately, or is it in low tech goods, in labor intensive products, or in extraction activities, or in services? Where's the biggest drops, the things that may be the hardest to recover? And I guess just the last thing is because I'm a China nerd and China geek, and I think about China all the time. And I just wanted to see maybe if you could take a little bit of the bait that Mary put out there, that investment into China is continued to rise, right? She mentioned 140 billion, and there is some variation. It looks like from the companies that I talk to and look at, investment into China that is directed for selling in the China market has gone up, while manufacturing in China for the global market has gone down some, with some shifts to other parts of Asia and maybe a little bit of onshoring. Do you see that? And how do we explain that? And then the second is outward Chinese investment, which has just fallen like a rock. I think the Rhodium Group has suggested that from 2015, a high of around 48 billion to last year about 7 billion in the US. And that seems to me central to the what's in your report with regard to national security. Part of it's probably, originally China being scared that they're going to lose a bunch of money and put their domestic financial system at risk. But it seems to me the sort of international national security overlay where folks are rethinking globalization just from a baseline is also a play. Anyway, so those are a variety of ideas that jumped out at me as I read and as I listened to your presentation and Mary's comments. So if you've got a little feedback, any feedback on that, great. And then we've got a bunch of questions that the audience is bringing in, which we'll get to.
So thank you, Scott, for these great comments, and thank you, building on Mary's great comments as well. So let's start with the national security dimension here. And I think this is where we really have to get these FDI screening mechanisms done right and targeted. And I have read the literature on CFIUS, and I think it's a strong sense that in the US that this has been implemented relatively responsibly. And then if you compare it to another country, the UK, which has just put in place a new FDI screening regime, which is much more loosey-goosey and elastic and a little bit more vague and deliberately, I think, set up to maximize discretion. And I think that the trick to pull off is, how can investors, when they assess the potential for investment, how can they be assured that if they invest perhaps in certain activities or sections, then they're going to fall outside of an investment regime, and the risk of any type of blockage is much lower. So I think we have to worry about the impact of the design of these regimes on investor expectations and forecasts. And I think there's probably better practice here and worse practice around the world. I should add, by the way, I think the OECD is doing quite nice work documenting those differences. With respect to supply chain resilience, I would really urge here that that the discussion amongst policymakers be really sort of driven by the evidence. There are extremely good analyses of how quickly firms respond or react to disruptions in their supply chains. And some of the more simplistic recommendations you hear from policymakers that firms should diversify their supply chains. I don't think it's realized that that diversification often comes at cost. In fact, the latest and perhaps the most comprehensive study I've ever seen on supply chain disruption suggests that diversification, yes, can reduce the probability of any one link breaking down, but it also increases the costs of the firms and slows down the ability of a firm to recover from a shock. So when we get into the empirics of this and we let the data speak, then some of the more simplistic recommendations that I fear may come out of Cornwall and elsewhere at the G7 really are cast in a bad light. So again, let's make this an evidence-driven discussion as well. Now, you've asked a lot of good questions about the data. I mean, I hesitate to disagree with you on anything on China, but I must tell you, when I engage with companies here in Europe, more and more of them are seeing the Chinese investment in China for the Chinese market. So the China for China strategy is there, and the use of China as an export platform, I think, is diminishing over time. Maybe I should stop there because I really am interested in hearing what some of the participants have to say as well.
Sure. Excellent. I think I'm just making sure I'm still not muted. That's great. I'm a year and a half in. Sometimes I don't know how to turn off the mute, and sometimes I don't know when to shut up. So let me ask a couple questions from the audience, and I'm going to put three of them together. They asked good questions about three things that could be affecting trends in FDI. One is monetary policies, right? We've got global interest rates extremely low. Is that so? Maybe we're seeing more movement in, I'm just guessing, portfolio investment and less equity investment. I don't know. Maybe that's what's driving their question. Second, about climate change and climate policy. Is it maybe the companies are responding to the higher costs to potential supply chain disruptions from climate change to localized production in a variety of places? And then lastly, digital technology, and which may make it easier to have production in a variety of different places. You can not just 3D printing, but other ways in which you can use the internet, so that one of the original benefits of foreign direct investment was chasing lower labor costs. But maybe as labor is less important to investment in general, you can locate investment in many different places without the same types of concerns. So what do you think about monetary policy, climate, tech?
So to directly answer this, I mean, you can understand an argument which says that very relaxed monetary policy reduces the cost of companies which want to borrow money to engage in cross-border and M&A. So one can see a story linking there. But again, cross-border and M&A is driven by a number of factors, and of course the stock market booms that we have seen are making it more and more expensive to engage in cross-border M&A. So there may well be a feedback effect there, which is negative following the cheap money. With respect to climate policy, I mean, I was really struck reading the UNCTAD reports of recent years, just how few projects there are in the climate-related sectors. So as an area where companies are investing, it does not seem to be as attractive as one might hope. Then, of course, you make a slightly different point, which is that concerns about presumably reducing emissions and carbon footprint might lead firms to localize production. But again, so much depends on, you can localize production, but when the overall carbon footprint of a factory is also going to depend on where it's sourcing its parts and components from and how its goods and services are being used. So I think the FDI part of this and moving closer to customers is only one part of the overall impact on the climate. And then with respect to digital tech, yes, this is transforming lots and lots of business models. I think the deeper question you raise is, we think of multinational corporations as having some internal attributes or expertise which national firms do not. And I think the interesting question is, to what extent is the digital transformation altering that core competence, that secret sauce which makes multinational corporations so effective? And I think that's a transformation which is underway. Mapping that transformation into FDI flows is something I think we still need to think through. Thank you.
Okay, cool. I've got one more question I wanted to ask. I also want to throw things back to Mary after to see what reactions she has or additional questions. The global trade alert is originally about trade. Your report today is about FDI. We've seen a rebound in trade in the last few months coming out of the pandemic. But if folks go to the back of your report and go country by country, et cetera, they'll notice that there is still trade-related protectionist measures that governments are issuing. What is the latest patterns that you see in trade-related measures in trade? Are the trends you're seeing in foreign direct investment paralleled in trade, or are we seeing actually maybe some type of differences in the two? Your microphone.
I'm muted. Yes, of course. So let me try and answer that. I mean, you're right. If you look at the annexes of our report, we show the trends in trade-related trade distortions and trade reforms, I should add. And there, it may not surprise you that what we've seen a lot of over the last year or so is a lot of subsidies which are in sectors which are very trade-related. And some of those subsidies are more or less objectionable, and some are clearly objectionable. A good example was the extremely generous bailout of Lufthansa, which the CEO of Lufthansa admitted was so generous that it was there to make Lufthansa a global national champion, not to get it through the pandemic. So there's a little bit of industrial policy mixing into it, but we see a lot of subsidization in trade-related sectors. And by the way, there's a lot of subsidies we don't include in the Global Trade Alert database. So please don't think that we blame all subsidies as being bad. I think when you come over to the FDI side, you probably see more trade or more measures which are restricting cross-border investment. So these localization measures I talked about, the FDI screening measures, increasingly we are seeing, obviously, but we will see potentially even stricter measures in the area of tax as well. So if anything, the policy mix is probably more negative, probably more skewed towards barriers in investment than it is in trade. And in trade, it's probably more skewed towards subsidies. So perhaps that's the difference that we've seen over the past 12 months.
Okay. Super helpful, super helpful. Thank you for enlightening us. I think it shows the report, how rich it is, and especially if you look at the data over time. Mary, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on some of these points that have been made and raised by the audience and by Simon.
Well, I think these are, very complicated questions. And I feel that, maybe everybody always says we're in a transformative age, but I actually really feel like we are. It's not just the need to adapt to climate change, which I think finally we are on the cusp of major transformation. It's also China's upgrading and Chinese policy, as well as the U.S. response that is moving the world. Let me just, as an example of that, say that, as far as FDI into China has been, the U.S. has never used China, U.S. multinationals have never used their foreign affiliates to export much back to the United States. They have traditionally used China for China. And we're hearing lots of other companies do the same, in part, or maybe driven largely by the fact that China's middle class is the fastest growing middle class in the world. So its market is becoming even more harvestable. But also because China is increasingly being seen as a platform for developing products that appeal to the developing world, that appeal to customers that are beginning to consume in other parts of the world. So I would argue that one of the things that we're seeing is regionalization, and it's a complex regionalization. And this is something that we need to kind of match the FDI up to the trade data, but the trends are going to look different than what we've seen before, and we need to really think hard about what trends would be indicative of this type. Should we call it decoupling? I'm not sure. If the US and China persist in this back and forth with restrictions, it could very well be decoupling. Simon noted that the CFIUS legislation was responsibly constrained. However, it's not clear how far other types of measures will go. We could see continued push to decouple the two production networks. That won't stop Asia from deepening its own production network. I'm doing some work right now on the Republic of Korea, and South Korea's integration with China has really proceeded at a pace. A lot of Korean exports have Chinese content and vice versa. We're going to see more of that with RCEP. We're going to see more of that as the Belt and Road infrastructure comes online. And we're going to see more of that as China continues its upgrading. So I think on a lot of different measures, we should be looking at regionalization as in response to this type of transformation. So there's just a lot of things going on here. One of our viewers did mention monetary policy. There's some reason to think that rates of return would decline. It is interesting to note that we are seeing a lot more portfolio investment into China, global financial flows are, again, also subject to transformation. So it's hard to really pick out the effect of, monetary easing in that world. So just a complex world, and it's a lot of challenges for analysts like the three of us.
Well, you both have helped us cut through a lot of this complications. Let me ask one final question for Simon that will help wrap this up, bring this session to an end. President Biden and Putin are going to be meeting in Geneva in a few days. Geneva is also the home to another organization that folks have forgot about, the WTO. What is the role of the WTO, the G7, the G20, in perhaps coming up with solutions? It's the World Trade Organization. I think in the 50s, they considered putting together a World Investment Organization, but there is not one. Foreign direct investment is only very marginally covered by WTO agreements. To address the challenges that you mentioned with regard to declining FDI, with the declining profitability, with insufficient FDI to promote sustainable development goals, when President Biden is in Geneva and he drops by the WTO, should he give them any messages, or what messages should the WTO hand to him when he goes there?
So thank you, Scott. I mean, the WTO does have a work program on investment facilitation at the moment, and that investment facilitation agenda is, to be honest, quite limited in scope. And indeed, some people have noted to me that maybe that investment facilitation agenda needs to be revised in light of the findings that we're showing here, the policies shifting against FDI. So I think there's a question as to whether the WTO members are focusing on the right elements of investment policy, and whether or not that negotiation needs to be upgraded. With respect to what could groups like the G7 and the G20 do? Well, it's great to see that the G7 is waking up and doing something about tax, but it would also be even better if they went a step further and also looked at all the different inducements that governments offer to try and lure foreign direct investment in the first place. Maybe, asking governments to get rid of all those investments is not going to happen, but maybe some rationalization and understanding that we should be targeting those investments in sectors which are either very employment intensive, which builds on Mary's point about the need to generate income, or which are very sustainable development intensive. Maybe some sense of focusing on incentives there could be important. And here, the United States, of course, could lead the way by directing its overseas support into these areas. So that might be a way of translating it back into US policy as well. But of course, this is not just on the US to change its policies. It's for all the big players, I think, to rethink how they're treating FDI, how they're encouraging it, and how their development policies can align with a coherent set of sustainable impact goals.
Terrific. Simon, I really want to thank you for the leadership that you've provided over the years in developing these databases on trade, on foreign investment, on government measures. Extremely helpful for all of us. And we hope that you keep at it. And we are going to be following the data that you provide to understand where things are headed. Is FDI going to continue to fall, or are we going to find ways to manage that balance between globalization and efficiency on one hand and national security and resilience on the other? And what is it going to look like around the world? I want to thank Mary for her fantastic comments and feedback on the report and on the broader issues. It's always helpful. I'm always educated when Mary participates in our events and activities. I also want to thank our team here at CSIS that put this on, both in the trustee chair as well as in the economics program. My partner in crime, Matt Goodman, has had to depart a little bit early because he's hosting another event in just a couple minutes. I also want to thank all of the audience who joined in and enthusiastically participated with their questions. I hope that we got to as many questions that you all wanted to as we could. Of course, feel free to follow up with CSIS or with Simon and Mary directly. So want to thank everybody for participating today. We'll be following these issues quite closely, and so we'll have more events and more writing on this topic in the future. Wish everyone a good day or evening wherever you are. Take care.